The right to be greedy, the practical necessity of demanding everything. 2. Individualism and collectivism. Quote, to be avoided above all is establishing, quote, society, once again as an abstraction over against the individual. The individual is the social being, end quote, the expression of his life, even if it does not appear immediately in the form of communal expression, carried out together with others, is therefore a manifestation and affirmation of social life. The individual and generic life of man are not distinct. However much, and necessarily so, the mode of existence of individual life is either a more particular or a more general mode of generic life, a more particular or universal mode of individual life. Quote, though man is therefore a unique individual, and precisely this particularity makes him an individual, a real individual, communal being, he is equally the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of society as thought and experienced, end quote. 24. Quote, altruism is the other side of the coin of, quote, hell is other people, end quote. Only this time, mystification appears under a positive sign. These put an end to this old soldier, crap once and for all. For others to interest me, I must find in myself the energy for such an interest. What binds me to others must grow out of the binds me to the most exuberant and demanding part of my will, to live. Not the other way around. It is always myself that I am looking for in other people, my enrichment, my realization. Let everyone understand this, and, quote, each for himself, end quote, taken to its ultimate conclusion, will be transformed into, quote, all for each, end quote. Freedom of one will be the freedom of all. A community which is not built on the demands of individuals and their dialectic can only reinforce the oppressive violence of power. The other, in whom I do not find myself, is nothing but a thing, and altruism leads me to the love of things, to the love of my isolation. For myself, I recognize no equality except that which my will to live accordingly to my desires recognizes in the will to live of others. Revolutionary equality will be indivisible to individual and collective. 25. Quote, let us notice first of all that the so-called rights of man are simply the rights of a member of a civil society, that is, of egoistic man, of man separated from other men and from the community. Liberty is, therefore, the right to do everything which does not harm others. The limits within each individual can act without harming others are determined by law. Just as a boundary between two fields is marked by a stake, it is a question of liberty, of man regarded as an isolated monad, withdrawn into himself. Liberty as a right of man is not founded upon the relation between man and man, but rather upon the separation of man from man. It is the right of such separation, the right of the circumferenced individual withdrawn into himself. It leads every man to see in other men not the realization, but rather the limitation of his own liberty. Quote, too many corpses strew the path of individualism and collectivism. Under two apparent contradictory rationalities has raged an identical gangsterism, an identical oppression of the isolated man, end quote. It is necessary, once again, to point out the self-absurdity of the one-sided abstractions, quote, the individual, end quote, and, quote, society, end quote, and of the ideologies founded on the one-sidedness, quote, individualism, or, quote, egoism, and so-called, quote, socialism, or, quote, collectivism, question mark. We can be individuals only socially. We can be social only individually. Individuals constitute society. Society constitutes individuals. Dig deeply enough into the individual, and you will find society. Dig deeply enough into society, and you will find the individual. Dig deeply enough into either, and you will come out the, quote, other, end quote, side. The concept named, quote, the individual, end quote, fully grasped, is the same as the concept named, quote, society. The concept named society, fully grasped, is also the individual. One is impossible, does not exist without the other. At the heart of society, it is, quote, opposite, end quote, the individual. At the end of the individual is his, quote, antithesis, end quote, society. We must speak of the social individual. Both the abstract universalities, quote, society, and, quote, individual, find the concrete universal in this social individual. Society without the individual is empty, is without its existence, just as the individual without society is without its existence. And even outside human society, it is not a human individual, even if it should chance to survive as a biological individual. However, even as such, it is the issue of a human social, in this case, sexual relationship. That was all in parentheses. Unless both of these moments can be affirmed simultaneously, univocally, grasped as a single unitary concept, in fact as a conceptual singularity, their contradiction having been transcended, parentheses, to begin with in thought, end quote, or end parentheses, then neither, quote, the individual nor society have been understood. Self-production can only be social. Society is self-production. That is, society is the only possible means of production of selves. You cannot ever talk about the, quote, self without identically implicating or talking about, quote, society. The, quote, self exists only in association with ourselves, i.e., in and as an association of selves, a society. It is no accident that the Latin root of, quote, consciousness, consistia, means literally, quote, together knowledge, end quote. Quote, to know together, end quote. Subjectivity is essentially intersubjective, that is, essentially social. Your individuality is already a social structure, and has been so from this very inception, including from its very conception. Individuality and social structure are quoted in that sentence. Individuals are produced only by society. Society is produced only by individuals. Society can be realized only egotistically, just as the ego can be arrived at, can be realized, and is possible at all only socially. The self is preeminent and essentially social. Society is preeminently and essentially selfish. If the philosopher of one-sided individualism or narrow egoism, that is, of the axiological of the self, want to understand Marxism socialism, they should reflect on his statement to the effect and that the other is a necessary part of yourself. The principle, quote, I want nothing other than myself, end quote, the principle of self-desire, self-attachment, parentheses, self-castration, end parentheses, becomes the principle of daily life in communist society. Once it is a social, actualize it, and the other is a necessary part of nation. Anti-individualism, that is, a collectivism, or one-sided socialism, so essential to Maoism in particular, and to revolutionary ideology in general, is congruent precisely with the project of the presence of private capitalism and private accumulation, together with the characterological tendencies correspond to these. On the part of bureaucratic capitalism, state capitalism, this police of repression, typified by the Maoist slogan, quote, smash, self, end quote, also has the effect of inhibiting the emergence of communist egoism within the home proletariat, a form of egoism which the bureaucracy confounds, consciously or unconsciously, with bourgeois egoism. Even privatism itself is a social expression, an expression of social life in a definite historical form of society, that is, privatism, in itself, an expression of social individual produced by a contemporary society. People who do not think dialectically end up making enormous errors here, practically as well as theoretically, because they cannot grasp contemporary as itself a social truth, admittedly self-reproducing, subjectification, i.e. internalization, of capitalist society, which is precisely an antisocial society, so much so that the, quote, socialization of society, end quote, is where capitalist society is concerned, but another name for the project of social revolution itself. The ideologies of anti-socialism are based on the misery of association, collective boredom, inauthentic association, under contemporary conditions, that is, on the misery of association as alienation and as estrangement. They are expressions of the poverty of social life. Its virtual non-existence is such in the world of strangers, the bellum omnium contra omnes, which is capitalist society. The leftist trapped the permanent false choice between the following his own immediate desire and sacrificing for his ideals. Despise the, quote, selfish, end quote, person who unhesitatingly chooses immediate private satisfaction. The genuine communist also despises this latter type, but for the opposite reason. Being restricted to immediate private satisfaction is not satisfying enough. The communist, furthermore, for such, quote, selfish people, end quote, to remain satisfied with their privatized alienated lives is a direct barrier to the realization of communists' own expanded self-interest. Somewhere in every rank and file leftist lurks a confused intuition that is the real reason for his contempt, but this intuition is socially stifled by the leftist's own instances on the, quote, necessity, end quote, of sacrifice. The lonely individualism of Ayn Rand is only alienation accepted and alienation perfected. Communist individualism, or individualist communism, is the name from the solution to riddle of prehistory, which, well, it has momentarily at times and places in the century existed, as yet knows not in its own name. Any, quote, collectivism, end quote, on our part, is an individual collectivism. Any, quote, individualism, end quote, on our part, is a collectivist individualism. Quote, nothing is more to me than myself, end quote. Fine. As it stands, this theorem is wholly acceptable. This is a classic statement of the egoist's postulate by the classic exponent of individualist anarchism and narrow egoism, and an early antagonist of Marx, Max Stirner. His later day followers, conscious and unconscious, include the, quote, objectivists, end quote, the, quote, classical liberals, end quote, and so-called, quote, libertarian right, end quote, in general. The problem is that in the further elaboration of his own books, Stirner's own understanding of his own statement proved to be equal to it. Stirner proved to be insensitive to what the concept of, quote, self, end quote, in order to be adequate to reality, must entail, what must be its content. if it is expanded, i.e. developed, beyond the level of its self-contradiction, namely all of the other selves which intermutedly, quote, constitute, end quote, or produce it. In short, society, this error is generally must be attributed to developing concrete self-knowledge. Stirner did not know himself, his own true identity, did not know himself as society, or society as his real self. If the validity of the egoistic moment has not been understood, then nothing has been understood. For each social individual, when his life is at stake, everything is at stake. If I allow myself to be sacrificed, then I allow the whole world of possible values to be sacrificed as far as I am concerned. If I am lost, then all the world is lost to me. Each time a person dies, a world dies. The community of egoists is the only possible community not founded on the repression of individual development, and thus ultimately a collective development as well. Quote, community egoism names the synthesis of individualism and collectivism, just as a communist society names the actual material sensuous solution to the historical contradiction of the, quote, particular, end quote, and the general, that's quoted, interest, a contradiction engendered, especially in the cleavage of society against itself, into classes. This, quote, solution, end quote, cannot be of the form of a mere idea or abstraction, but only a concrete form of society. In that paragraph, the word census is spelled sensuous, so it's sensuous or some shit. Next paragraph. The global and exclusive power of workers' councils, of the anti-state, of the associated producers, or, quote, generalized self-management, end quote, that is, concentrated egoism, is the productive force of the social relation of production, which can supersede all the results of the uncoordinated egoistic activity of men. These are, in their totality, alienation, the unconscious development of the economy, the unconscious production of the proletariat of the economic, quote, laws of capitalism, with all their disastrous consequences. From the proletariat, the theory of communist egoism is complete only as a theory of revolutionary organization, and as a theory of revolutionary practice in general, as a theory of the new social relations, and as a theory of the practice of councils. That is, it is adequate only as a theory of communist society, and as a theory of the transition from state and capitalism to communist society. Obviously, then, these theses have still a long way to go toward the concrete. The essence of communism is egoism. The essence of egoism is communism. This is the world-changing secret, which the world at large still keeps from itself. The unraveling of the secret, as the emergence of radical subjectivity, is nothing other than the process of the formation of communist society itself. It is already contains objective process. Quote, but man is only individualized through the process of history. He originally appears as a generic being, a tribal being, a herd animal, though by no means a, quote, political animal, end quote, in the political sense, exchange itself in a major agent of this individualization, end quote. There's a quote inside a quote on that one. Thus, in a sense, all history has, parentheses, in the long run, and only implicity, end parentheses, been a process of individualization. The individualization reaches its highest point of advertisement in the epoch of corporate capitalism, but private property's, quote, individualism is not but its most cherished illusion. The predominant characteristic of private property is a materialized reification, where the egoism of its subjects, parentheses, capitalists and workers alike, end parentheses, is suppressed and subordinated to the pseudo-subjectivity of the, quote, economy for itself, end quote. The truth of the capitalist society and its private property is not individual property, but dispossession. The proletariat, the truth of private property is nothing other than the production, the reproduction, and growth of dispossessed and propertyless class, the class of wage labor. Private property is thus the very negation of individualism and of individual property for the overwhelming majority of its subjects, i.e., the proletariat. Private property is by no means individual property, but rather it is loss, i.e., sale, alienation of self. Being for another. Even the capitalists are at best mere agents of capital, managers of their own and the general dispossession. The mythical, quote, individualism of capitalist society can only be realized as its own negation, and in the negation of the society from which it sprang. Thus the Paris Commune of 1871, the first realized, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, attempted to abolish private property in order to, quote, make individual property a truth, end quote. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of the law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of the negation. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but gives him individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, i.e., on cooperation and possession in common of the land and of the means of production, end quote. The revolution of generalized self-management is the movement from a narrow to full egoism, egoism's own self-enrichment. It is egoism's ascent from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. It is egoism's ascent from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom.